Oh,
Howdy, y'all.
I had
Welcome
a
to
weird screen. Apology.
yeah, welcome to Popular Liberty. I got two wonderful crypto developers. I got Amaury Sachet from eCash and Tobias Ruck from Lotus, and we're going to be talking today a lot about the crypto side of the Liberty equation, and a lot of stuff that's coming down the pike, namely CDBs, as central bank digital currencies, and ESG scores. And we got a lot to say about this. But first, why don't you guys introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about the projects you're working on and how you're attempting and how you see the future of the monetary and banking system unfolding, and what your currencies that you're working on are doing to try to get ahead of it.
Well, I'm gonna go first because I said hum. So I'm working on a project called eCash. Before that, I was working on Bitcoin Cash, BCH. Some people may be aware of it. It used to be pretty big, and then when I left, it used to be not that big anymore, unfortunately. But that's how things go. Now I'm working on eCash, and so what is eCash? Well, it's in the name, right? It's digital cash, and the goal is really that, right? The goal is to have a version of cash that works digitally. And for people, what does that mean, right? To do any kind of transfer of value in the world, you have to use a third party, except when you use cash, right? When you pay by credit card or via PayPal or whatever, there are a bunch of intermediaries like your bank, like PayPal, like Visa, MasterCard, whatever that is, who process the transaction for you. And the only situation where you pay directly from one person to the other is cash. And one of the problem I identified like years ago, and I'm not the only one, I cannot claim it's an original thought, but I was in that bandwagon, like that doesn't exist online. And as more and more activity move online, that's bigger and bigger of a problem, because effectively those intermediaries, they control your access to the financial system. And that may sound like you are not part of the financial system or whatever, but every time you buy something, you are doing financial stuff, right? And when a small portion of the economy goes through that, they kind of have to, play by the rules. But as there is less and less cash, those organizations have more and more and more control. And even if they are not evil themselves, they also, they can be evil, but they also have government behind them that can constrain them in some way. And
I just want to unpack that for 1 second. Yeah. Like PayPal. I mean, they can shut you down because they're woke assholes, or they can shut you down because the government's leaning on them to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And, we've seen that, that anytime you have an intermediary, anytime you have a human in the loop, that's a human that can get shut down by the government. And so what you really want in a monetary system is as few intermediaries as possible, as few humans in the loop as possible, as few trusted third parties as possible. Because if you have any human in the loop that is a third party you have to trust, the government can get to you. And this seems to be far more likely to be coming down the pike, in like 10 times the level when we get to central bank digital currencies, which is programmable money that is programmed by the state.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can assume just right off the bat, this is not going to be programmed for our benefit. And so there's quite a few mechanisms that they're probably going to be able to use by installing these intermediaries, like these banks, which are technically private. The Federal Reserve is technically a private company, and that's really not.
You have to own shares at if you're a bank, right? You have to buy shares of the Federal Reserve, and you get profit share or something from them, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, and you basically that this is the these intermediaries can be leaned on by the federal government to say, hey, well, we don't like Nick Fuentes or someone like that, and he needs to get his banking privileges shut down, and all of the banks shut him down immediately. And there's no law passed, no one voted on it, and all it is just, hey, we don't like this guy. How about you take care of him for us?
And this is not hypothetical, right? It happens a few times. Like it happened for WikiLeaks a few years ago. More recently, it happened for the Freedom Convoy in Canada. Now it's happening to Russian people. And whatever you think of the situation, I mean, like many Russian people have nothing to do with it.
Like nearly all.
like 95%.
140 million of them,
Russian
and they have a
people,
2 million man army. And 150 people basically in charge of the whole government.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like Russia is a great democracy where the people have all voted for the invasion of Ukraine, right? So most of them has literally no influence on the situation. They just happen to be Russian, and suddenly their financial well-being is wrecked. And I was not WikiLeaks, and now they're kind of like looking for trouble, leaking government secret, and then those truckers, they kind of are annoying, right? They're honking. Those Russians, they're far away, and we don't really like them, right? But
when is your turn, right? At some point it's your turn.
Because
those
like,
metalheads.
Every time you check out someone at the extreme, right? What happened is that there is someone else that is not at the extreme, and that can be chopped off, right? And eventually this is you. So people need to be thinking about that very carefully. There is no reason that it stopped, and in fact, there is all the reason to think that it's going to accelerate, because as the technology to do that becomes better, and with CDBC, it really becomes better, and more and more activity moves online, and less cash is actually being used, the capability to do that increases, and there is no reason to think that it would stop.
Tobias, I want you to take it from right there and talk about how ESG scores, what they are, and how they're going to play into what he just talked about with the CDBCs and cancel culture.
So I don't know too much about ESG scores, but I can talk about the CBDC a little. So recently, the Boston Fed dropped a paper called Project Hamilton, and they were basically announcing that they were working on a central bank digital currency. And then I was like curious, like, okay, how does it actually work? And engineers are always like how do they build that? And I didn't expect what I was seeing. Amaury was like, oh no, obviously they would do that. But what the model they were picking is actually strikingly similar to the Bitcoin model, right? They're using the same UTXO coin model that we're seeing on Bitcoin. They only did a bunch of optimizations. And then I was reading further and I realized that actually they were using the same optimizations that we've been talking about, and especially Amaury has been talking about for a while on to do on Bitcoin, and that's why Bitcoin Cash was started. And then after that, after that wasn't really able to accomplish those goals. eCash, basically another fork of Bitcoin Cash, is now trying to do that. But yeah, maybe you can enlighten us a little more about the ESG scores.
Well, ESG scores is like the main how I see the main enforcement mechanism for how the CDBCs are going to target. This is like the target acquisition mechanism here. So how do you know who's your enemy and not? Well, you need some sort of metric to be able to measure, in a fairly objective sort of way. It doesn't have to be perfect.
Oh, social credit score.
Basically, yeah, this is the social credit score that's coming, and it stands for environment, social impact, and governance. So that's the ESG. So yeah, 3 Orwellian terms right off the bat, and they really didn't spare the Orwell in this one. So So yeah, basically they're going to be measuring you on what's your carbon footprint. So basically that like that right there is how they're going to target the Bitcoin guys and how they're going to target the people who want to use proof of work to excuse me, that proof of work in order to do transactions and other and mining and stuff like that, because they use a lot of energy, even though it's like overwhelmingly green energy that they're using. Never mind that. Yeah,
there are reasons for that. If you want, we can dig into it, but the profile of the energy consumption of Bitcoin is very different from what people expect.
Yep.
And there are reasons for that. There are technical reasons for that, an economic reason for that, but also what's interesting is that all the environmental measures that are being taken to, kind of like curb the impact of Bitcoin mining is actually pushing the Bitcoin mining toward energy sources that are less green.
I know. It's crazy that they're talking about, like the Bitcoin and other proof of work coins as if they're, like wasting energy, as if they're destroying the if they're just all pollution engines and stuff like that. Really what's happening is they're driving the adoption of green tech and green energy, and because those are the more cost-effective models for them. And even like in the when you find like here in Texas, what's happening is that a whole bunch of people, we have this abundant reserve of natural gas where we've just been flaring it because it's coming up out of the ground faster than we can capture it. So what we do is we just flare it in order to make it less of a environmental impact. And so what a whole bunch of Bitcoin miners thought about was, well, hey, what if we just attached like a hose to this thing, and we had it all go into generators and stuff like that for mining Bitcoin and stuff like that. And I know you guys are not Bitcoin guys. I'm not a maxi at all, but I thought, this is a genius idea to where you actually managed to make this productive instead of just wasting it. And so even they're driving. So basically even right there, they're cleaning up pollution, that they're making this thing much less polluting. And so,
go ahead.
At the same time, these are not controlled by the government. So they're still getting counted as enemies here, because they're eventually going to be enemies of the central bank. So they're still going to get punished under this ESG score that that it's designed to measure who's an enemy and who's not. And when you couple that with like programmable money in a central bank digital currency, then now I have a programmable way to reward people for basically spending their money on the higher social credit score or whatever items, and punishing them for the more socially unacceptable for the lower social credit score options.
So there are a few things that I want to add to what you said, not because this is wrong, but I think they are necessary for the whole argument to make sense. And those are like a few technical explanation about the electrical grid works and the system works and why it's pushing miner toward those kind of technology. Well, so electricity is an energy source that we don't know to store really, right? So you may have batteries and stuff like that, but the capacity of those is completely negligible toward compared to the general amount of power that is flowing on the grid, right? So our capacity to store electricity is extremely small, right? So you are in an environment where everything that is produced needs to be consumed like almost immediately. And even worse than that, if there is more demand than there is energy produced, then you get blackouts, right? Like it's not like, oh, your electricity, is a bit less powerful today or whatever, right? It's just like it doesn't work. If there is not enough, it doesn't work. The grid goes down. And so what's happening in practice is that electricity producer, they try to estimate as best as they can how much electricity is going to be consumed at any given time, and they target that and they take some security margin. right? And then the surplus of electricity that they have, that they cannot do anything with, they have to burn. And a very significant amount of electricity produced is burned that way. Like people don't really know that, I guess, but this is part of the
how the grid works.
Yeah, this is part of how the grid works, right? Because if you don't do that, you're gonna fry all the electricity device when there is not enough demand, and you're gonna have blackout when there is too much demand, right? So this just doesn't work. So what you do is that you produce a bit more and you burn the surplus. And when you start adding into the mix renewable, like solar or wind or whatever, you add even more uncertainty, because now it's not just the consumption of people that you need to estimate, but how much those renewable are going to produce. It's going to depend on the wind and the sun that day, right? So now the uncertainty is even greater, and with greater uncertainty means that you need to take greater security margin for the grid to keep working. And so what's happening is that you have this surplus of electricity, but this surplus of electricity is not in places where the electricity is needed. And so there's nothing you can do with it except something that uses electricity that can literally be anywhere, even if it's like in the nearby to a power plants in like a rural area where there is nothing else. And guess what? Mining is mining is the perfect use case for that. Like you have this electricity that you're gonna burn and you can turn it into revenue instead. And this electricity is not like, it's actually a cost.
Oh yeah,
for
you're able to move a cost.
Energy producer. It's not like surplus electricity. It would be good if they were able to sell it, whatever. No, it costs them money because now they need to get rid of it in some way.
And now they're able to move energy from the cost column to the revenue column. And
exactly.
But even and this is where I had this question ahead of time for you guys, because I'm big into like solar physics and stuff like that, and I've been looking at, hey, this is like there's something called a geomagnetic excursion that happens every few tens of thousands of years, and we got unlucky that it's happening in our lifetime. And it's just that shit luck happens. And what happens is the North Pole and the South Pole are about to be basically right now, they are already in the process of moving down to basically the equator. And during this time, the magnetic field of Earth gets a whole lot weaker and a whole lot more unstable. And so now, what you've seen recently that minor events from the sun are starting to cause bigger and bigger geomagnetic storms, and which did not used to happen. And so we're looking at a scenario coming up where you're going to have much greater geomagnetic instability, which, if you know anything about like solar physics, I mean, we've all heard the solar flare. Does it like doomsday scenario? Well, this could be like almost a normal thing, during a geomagnetic excursion, because your field gets a lot weaker and a whole lot more unstable. And so, you could have little solar flares that give you major storms, and these are big issues for power plants. Like, how do you deal with all this? And you need a way of balancing the load, and so that you don't get the wires to melt, because if there's too much electricity.
It's not just that, it's that the grid itself makes giant loops effectively, right? Like, we don't think about that when we see them because it's so much bigger than us, but it's loops, and loops mean inductance. So if you have solar flare and stuff like that, you're gonna have inductance in the grid. Plus, electronic devices are not gonna like that at all.
Oh yeah. And so what ends up happening is that you'll either have like transformers blow, or if it's really bad, you'll have the wires themselves will start to melt. And and so what you have to do is you have to balance this load all across everywhere. Because it's not just what you're producing now, is what the Earth is producing and inducing into the wires. And I was thinking about this earlier, like, oh, this is something that crypto could really help with, it could help avert a potential doomsday scenario where now all of a sudden you need to be balancing the load everywhere. You have to basically turn off the power plants because the earth is going to be doing all of the production for you, and it all needs to go somewhere, and it's going to be producing far more than the grid can handle. So now what do you do with it? Well, I mean, you need some way of getting it to go, to be spent as quickly as possible. You need to turn every single light on in the in the nation. And you need to, what you really need is a way of saying, okay, where are my problem sources going to be, and how can I stack as much crypto miners right there as possible that are kind of just lying dormant, but they're there to save the grid in a potential solar flare scenario. And I was looking at this as a this proof of work thing, actually, that's using a lot of energy. This could actually be a way of averting a grid down scenario. And I was thinking to myself earlier, okay, how would you guys, because you guys understand the technology really well, how would you guys go to these local municipalities and these electric companies and say, hey, look, you guys got this problem. It's unlucky that this happened in our lifetime with this geomagnetic excursion, and this is here. It's here to stay for the rest of our lives, and it's only going to get worse. We think that these crypto miners are actually a solution to the problem, not to the cause of it. And they're not going to be the cause of it. They're a solution to it. So how would you guys take the explain the technology to a local government guy who doesn't know anything about electrical grids and doesn't know anything about crypto mining, and also doesn't know anything about the solar stuff? But how would you take this to them and explain it in a way that actually gets them to support it and start adopting this as a solution?
Well, I don't know if it's so difficult, to be honest, not because of for a simpler reason. I wouldn't sell it that way. I would just sell it as a way to make electricity cheaper. Because
How so?
Well,
because you're getting rid of the costs.
You're moving something from a cost column to a revenue column, right? So the best thing you can do, both for the planet and for crypto mining in general, is to move as many of those miners as possible nearby to power plant to consume the surplus, because this is a place where electricity literally have a negative cost, right? Because you want to get rid of it. So this is the place where electricity is the cheapest. Literally, it has a negative cost. Everything here, everywhere else, it's more expensive. So you want to be moving those miners there as fast as possible, and for that to happen, you want the market to do its things, right? So you need to get out of the way. And if nothing else, you may want to be pointing at, hey, this is needed here. There is a good opportunity. If there is a good opportunity, you can convince people to do it if there is money to be made.
And what kind of technology are you guys using? Because you guys aren't using ASICs for eCash and Lotus, right?
No, actually, there's eCash, and both eCash and Lotus are both using the SHA-256 algorithm. So what people need to understand is that there's ASIC friendly and ASIC unfriendly algorithm. So what is an ASIC? An ASIC is basically a device that can only do one specific computation. ASIC means
the circuit board is literally designed to do
application specific integrated circuit. Yeah, it can only do this one application specific computation. Which means you can't use it for anything else. But what you get in return is you get, compared to a CPU, if you use your normal CPU that's inside a normal computer, you get 1,000,000x or something. Or is there maybe 10,000x of the performance, watt per watt, how much computation you get. Yeah, I think it's around 1,000,000. So
something like that.
Yeah,
I don't even know what the ratio is, but it's absurd. Yeah,
it's absurd.
It's so big that it's not even worth looking at the ratio anymore. Effectively,
yeah, it's too many zeros. So a modern ASIC costs brings 100 terahashes. What's a terahash? A terahash is 1 billion computations per second. And on my computer, I was only able to get like 1 million computations of the same algorithm. So you can see this. I mean, of course, an assay costs 100 times more. So in this case, you would have a 100 million x, but
Well, I mean, you
if
get
you factor in the cost, yeah.
Basically, it's a factor. Your revenue goes up at a factor of 10 faster than your cost does. With an ASIC. Basically, you're getting 1,000 as a cost factor goes up of a cost of 100, but your revenue goes up at a factor of 1,000. So it's a factor of 10 right there. And this idea that, hey, you would want to put all of these miners right next door to the power plant in order to basically pay them to smoke their own crack, so to speak. And I mean it's a dream come true scenario for them. And that in the event of a real hardcore grid down scenario, like this is the sort of thing that would save your butt, because you'd be able to put all of that extra energy into, like, there's a place for it to go, and it doesn't just stay inside the grid and melt it. And like back in the 1859 with the Carrington event, that was like okay, so there's multiple classes of solar flares. X class is the highest, and for every number you put into it, it goes up by like a factor of 1. So X2, so like X1 is like the base. X10 is a factor of 10 bigger than that, and X100 is a factor of 10 bigger than that. So
but you said it goes up by a factor of 1. Like if you
it goes up
by
basically 100%. So
X1
X1 is the base. Basically. Yeah, X2 is twice as powerful. X3 is 3 times as powerful as an X1, et cetera, and an X6 would be twice as powerful as an X3. So the back in the 1859, you had what was called the Carrington event, and back then, this was like the first time we ever found out, like, oh, the sun can do this, and where it has these major flares. And what happened was, the grid physically melted. You had like transformers that you like just going down the block, and they just like one would go boom after another. And what happened was, you had telegraph operators who were, kind of seeing this in real time, and they're like, oh, I bet, they weren't understanding what was going on, but they were like, oh, I better run. I can see the booms are going like right next to where my telegraph machine works. So they would like run as fast as they could to get to their machine and unplug it so that their telegraph machine didn't go boom. And it didn't, but it also didn't shut off. Because what was happening is that the machine was unplugged but still active because of all of the electric current that was flowing just ambient, and so you would have 2 telegraph wire operators who were able to talk to each other even though both of their machines were unplugged, and because and you had wires all over the place just melting because this was like an X45 flare, and it was just huge. And we had only one that was even kind of close to it back in Halloween of 2003, which was it was officially recorded as an X23, but that's because that's because the sensor on the satellite only goes up to 23. We didn't think it was going to be that big, but our models suggested it was probably closer to like an X40, and so. We were and you were having like blackouts in Europe, blackouts in Canada, blackouts in Africa, and blackouts all over the United States where transformers just went boom. And but if we had some stuff like this, with crypto on the grid, now you have a place for all of that extra electricity to go, and you have a way of actually balancing out the that extra juice that's coming in from the earth itself, that's being induced from our own magnetic field. And this is going to be something that it is essential in the basically for the rest of our lives, because this geomagnetic excursion is only going to make things worse. It's only going to get worse and worse and worse for the next 100 years or so before it ends. Okay,
now I have a few concerns. Like, this sounds absolutely amazing, and because it's basically free energy, But I think the biggest issue, obviously, is that it's very unreliable and probably all very spontaneous.
Well, it's
right?
like extremely dangerous.
Yeah, extremely dangerous. So what I think you're suggesting is that we like put up loops or whatever, which like capture these events in order to like.
But
well,
no,
it's
you
a way of
already have
protecting the
loops,
grid.
right? The electric grid, the existing electric grid is already a giant loop.
Okay, so you put
Yeah.
that into
So
the.
that's actually the problem. That's why it's frying devices when that happens.
Mhm.
Because the loop is an inductance, right? And so you have inductive current and well, it's in the loop and everything is connected to the loop.
Basically, you have a way more electricity than the grid can handle. And this is why the wires melt and the transformers blow up, is that it needs to go somewhere and has nowhere to go. And so it just stays there and accumulates. And so you need somewhere to put this thing into. And if you have all of these proof of work systems that really, really need it, and they can, and if you have some excess capacity, that's really, really helpful. In the
so you might almost like mandate, there's like states where you have to have a gun at home. You have to be like, no, you have to have a miner at home, and it has to be plugged in, and it shuts on once like a specific trigger happens, like there's too much.
Yeah, I mean, you would say, hey,
take energy from the system.
Yeah, and this is how you would you could have it like right next to the meter in every home, as to say that, hey, this is here to run on the off chance that we get one of these these solar flares that could be a grid that would otherwise cause a grid down scenario. And this is like my way of okay, so how would, if I were going to like mandate basically crypto adoption, how would I do it? Well, this is that right there is how I would do it. And because I see this CDBC coming down the pike, I see these ESGs coming down the pike, my first instinct is, okay, I need to get ahead of this, and I need to do it with a currency that is actually scalable, actually works, and wonderful that at the same time we're having terrible inflation. So my idea would be, okay, the CDBCs are going to be mandated down my throat, and so the enemy clearly has no problem with using force, and neither do I. So what if I started mandating these miners be installed in every single house, and that the power plants have to do the same thing, like next to them or something like that, and that now all of these and also at the same time, hey, now that we have all of this cryptocurrency being generated, how are we going to get it used? Well, my idea is, well, okay, how about we mandate, that, hey, part of your salary that you're paying your employees has to be, at least in part, paid in currency, cryptocurrency, and not like, exchanging it for dollars or whatever, but like, no, it's like a fixed amount, like it's like 5 Lotus or 5 eCash, that has to be there. It's like an actual fixed number, rather than the exchange rate.
Yeah, obviously 5 eCash wouldn't make sense because that would be the cost of one transaction, but yeah.
And by doing this, you would basically give them we'd be weaponizing Gresham's law in order to push out the weaker currency. I'm forgetting. I know Gresham's law is the one where the stronger currency gets pushed out, but there's a flip side to it. I forget the other one's name, like Thor's law or something like that, where it's here's how the weaker currency gets pushed out, and depends on which one you're advantaging. And this is how I would build like an advantage mechanism for something like eCash or Lotus. And I would backdoor it in. I would just get it installed first under the guise of, hey, we actually really do need this as a way of protecting the grid, and nothing to do with solving inflation or whatever. But now that we have this, camel's nose under the tent. Here's how here's how we could mandate it from a back door from there, just by using local governments. And if the central banks or the states have a problem with it, well, they'll see them in court. And and when I've got something like this already in, it makes their argument of why it shouldn't be a much harder thing to do.
So one thing that I think might be a big bottleneck on that idea is that the cost of mining is actually mostly hardware costs, right?
Yeah.
So you would have to really amp up the production of silicon in order for that to work. But I mean, the alternative would be just to put like you have to either, you can give a choice, like either you have to put like a heating coil or whatever, which just heats the air or whatever in order to dissipate the electricity, or you buy a miner, right? You can pick either, and then people are like, wait a second, if I just buy a miner, I make money. The other thing just heats my room, and I have to get rid of that. So I think that might.
Well, the miner is your room too, so in a way, unless
you also
have a
get
heat
points.
pump, you get that.
So it might be ideal for like cold places. So I'm not sure if Texas might be the ideal.
I mean, Texas does not have that problem.
Well, this is why I would sometimes when Ted Cruz goes to Cancun, but yeah.
That's why I would go with a like a mine or something, is that, you know, it has that option, that has that benefit of you actually make money off of it rather than you rather than you like lose money off of it, and you have to, because then you just have to deal with the heat, whereas at least here you're getting paid to deal with the heat.
So yeah, once you like, if you do both, if you do that, then you might be like, oh, this hugely increases the demand for chips. It's especially these ASICs. So you would have to be prepared.
I really want those. You know, I want a currency is actually going to get used properly. And because I see this as like the this right here is like the number one place. How do you get it adopted? It's like, well, the enemy has that problem solved already. They know how they're going to get it adopted. You know, it's at gunpoint. And we need that same level of competition, basically, to where you've mandated it into the supply chain by forcing people to, one, have it, and two, use it in paying their people. Now you have it as part of a cost in every single supply chain. It's like, okay, you're going to be paying because now you're going to be paying your taxes to your local government, partly in US dollars and partly in Lotus or eCash or something like that, because that's how the taxes must be done. You have to, once you mandate it into the supply chain, that's where it's going to start propagating outward. Because now I have to.
Right, this is true. But if I'm the government, why would I do that? Because I'm getting the branch.
The question is, I'm the government. Why would I do it? That's the thing. That's why I say local government, is that I'm going to mandate it at the local level, and if the state has a problem with it, well, I'll see him in court.
I think he's talking about the American model, where you have like for us Europeans, that's like totally absurd. It's like, why would the government ever do that, right? That sounds like a retarded idea. But for an American, it's like, no, there's like not the government. There's like the federal government, and they're basically like or like lizard people.
They're really
overlords.
far away in Washington.
Yeah, and then there's like my local sheriff or something, right? And they have completely different incentives, right? So whatever the local government can, like, if they can get like a tiny little bit of an advantage, they will do that if they can do that. So that's like the interesting thing, and that's going on in America, which is why I like Andrew's ideas, that like you kind of engineer like these tiny little things that just work in these local governments. And one of those could be that you mandate like mining or like getting these
well, again, you mandate the the miners to be installed in all of the homes in any particular locality, and then you copy paste that to every single locality. Grant you have to do that like one or two at a time, but eventually you get to the point where it's an entire state, or it's an entire it's an entire region, and at that point it really starts to make sense. And
it doesn't have to be limited to mining and like heating. It could be also just general provision of computation, right? Like something like AWS, but just for computation. I'm not sure if that makes a ton of sense, but like for especially machine learning, it's also like very compute heavy. So that might be another thing. But
the problem for those is like you don't have the same kind of uniform demand. Like for cryptocurrency, they can be like 1 terahash on the network or 100 exahash on the network, and in both cases it works, right? So you don't have that for training, because training a neural net, the energy is needed when someone wants to train a neural net, right? This is
True.
why the
Mhm.
mining stuff is so different from everything else. So this is why you can use that specifically to consume the extra power of, say, like a power plant or whatever, right? Because like if you build a service, you're like, okay, we're gonna train your neural net for very cheap, but it's only gonna happen when there's extra electricity of the grid that we need to get rid of, and we don't know when that is, and we don't know how much that is, right? Like this is just not gonna work.
Yeah.
I think this is one thing to point out from like mining. It is memoryless. I'm not sure if people immediately understand what that means. It means that that you don't make any progress, right? It's just completely random. Every single hash that gets computed, that could be the lucky one, and every hash you computed that isn't the lucky one is a complete waste, basically, quote unquote. Like you don't get anything for that in return.
Yeah, it's like
So that
rolling
means,
dice, except the dice have like billions of faces.
yeah, even
Yeah.
more than that. And so what happens is that you can stop and start anytime you want, and you can basically, you don't need to store anything. You can just continue. You can like that is why this is actually a very good application of just getting rid of energy, because you don't care when it's demanded. And
Yeah,
also
exactly.
we have a thing called difficulty adjustment. So if there's too much electricity going on the system right now, too much mining going on, then the difficulty will go up. So you will require more electricity to mine the same thing. So many people see that, oh, that's like a waste, right? Like like there's nothing produced from like getting more electricity running on there, like more hashes running on there.
How do
But
you guys solve that in, do you in Lotus and eCash?
yeah, we also have difficulty adjustment. Yeah, eCash, Lotus have the same difficulty adjustment algorithm, even as Bitcoin Cash, right? Bitcoin Cash, eCash, and Lotus have all the same difficulty adjustment algorithm. It's called assert, and it basically just takes like a exponential average, or maybe Omri can explain the details, but I'm not sure if it's too relevant. But maybe Andrew likes to hear about that.
Well, I wanted to know, like, do you guys connect this difficulty adjustment with interest rates at all? Because this is like one of Mises's major contributions to, like, how do you, like, if there's so much mining, it's because the price has gone up so much, and the difficulty level has not been adjusted. The opposite way you would deal with that is you would have interest rates that would say, okay, the price has gone up because there's too little supply, so I'm going to be so now I'm going to have an interest rate that's now sky high, and to incentivize people to shove more of their savings out into the system through a loan. And so you would solve that through and this was like Mises's major thing with his regression theorems, that he kind of proved that the main value of money really is its time value. And it's it's that ability to store wealth across time is what money.
So space and time, both. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so so basically you would use an interest rate instead of or maybe in addition to a difficulty mechanism. Like your difficulty mechanism would then be your secondary, your backup, just in case the interest rate didn't go high enough. I was wondering if you guys had in like eCash or Lotus any current or any future plans to build in that interest rate bid mechanism. I would see it going something like kind of an auction where, like kind of on like in like a stock price or something like that. You can, like, I know on my like TD Ameritrade or something like that, you can, I can switch views and see, okay, what are people bidding at and what are people asking, for a particular stock or whatever, and there'll be two different prices and there's a difference between them, and this is how, and whatever the last price is what it's currently priced at. And you would have something like that with interest rates, where you have a bid and an ask mechanism for so you would have like real time bids on loans and stuff like that, and this is how you would control supply and demand and manage it a little bit better. And
what would the interest be on? Like if you give a
loan,
or
on a loan for any particular time scale. So basically you would have columns for, hey, what about a 1 month, 3 months, 6 month, all the way up to like 30 years or something like that, the way that you have a yield curve right now.
Well, we don't, and like not to crush your dreams, but you don't have loans as part of the protocol in eCash
Yeah.
nor Lotus. But
I know.
what people
I was
can
wondering,
do,
like, do you have, is there a way to do that? Because this part of the coding part is something I don't quite understand how it's developed. And I was wondering, is there anything like this that could be developed, or is it like just completely, you could not do it that way?
I mean, like you can do it that way, but yeah, as Tobias mentioned, it's not really something that needs to happen at the protocol level, right? Like, but that's a business idea, right? Like you can build a business that effectively like makes loan, and on the other side try to gather capital from people, and you would offer an interest rate on the capital to be able to make the loans at the other side, right? And
like if you have a smart
be a sort of
contract,
crypto bank if you do that, and that's a perfectly valid business.
Like if you have smart contracts at the protocol level, basically this would be an extension of that to where, okay, it's like you're bidding on a contract for a loan. And
or you can write a smart contract that effectively does that as well. But same thing, like it doesn't need to be baked in the protocol, and that's probably a good thing, right? Because different people are gonna want to try different way to compute the interest rate based on different risk profile and whatnot, and then the market can decide, what what works and what goes bankrupt.
Well, yeah, basically you'd be building something like this into the protocol, like this bid ask mechanism, which would give you a better way of controlling supply.
Like I'm honestly not sure it's a good idea to build that in the protocol, because everything that is in the protocol, everybody has to agree on. And so that's a very high bar. That's a very high bar to pass, right? And that's also mean that you cannot really change it very easily, right? It's very, very difficult to change because like almost everybody needs to come to an agreement that you need to change in some way. So generally speaking, you want as little as possible to go in the protocol itself. You want the protocol to enable building whatever people want to build, right? As much as possible, but you want to bake as little as possible in the protocol, because the problem is if you bake something in the protocol and you get it wrong, the consequences are very dire.
Well, you have to support it forever,
right?
You have
well, because it's very difficult to change, right? So,
and also the way it works, like we had that in Bitcoin, like there were historic changes, but you have to maintain those changes forever, because if you do an initial block download, you have to verify that the blocks are valid. And in order to verify the blocks that are valid, you have to check that the rules are true, like that the rules are followed. And if you add the rule and then you later remove it, and then maybe later you add it again, you have to like keep every single of those rules. You have to keep in you have to keep a timestamp when it was added. You have to keep a timestamp when it's removed, things like that. So this creates like this historic baggage, so to speak, right? Like something that you have to carry on for forever. It's like the same as if you were to like change the instruction set on a computer, more or less, right? Like everybody has to change that, and it gets really messy. What is much better is that what you said, like a smart contract, where instead of putting it into the protocol itself, you write like a program that runs on the consensus rules on the protocol, and that you can like update as you, or you can make a new smart contract, and you can.
So a smart contract would be like a layer 2 or 3 or something like that. It would be a higher.
Well, it depends
layer.
on how you define layer, but in this case, it would not run on the. It would not be like
it
coded.
Would run on the base layer.
It would run on the base layer, but it would not
layer.
coded be in the base layer. If that makes sense. Like it's the difference.
It would be like a program on your computer instead of being the computer itself.
Is it like the OS layer, or is it application layer or something like that?
Yeah, the protocol would be like even
OS.
lower than the OS. I'd say it's like the equivalent of the hardware, pretty much in that analogy.
It's hard to make an analogy, but I think the best one is like changing the instruction set of like Intel, for example, versus just writing a different program, right? Like writing a C.
Yeah, you got to realize that
C, using different instructions.
The Intel's instruction set has been created in the 60s or the 70s, something like that, and like everything that they've done since then. So like that's many decades by now, right? Like that's more than 50 years. Everything they've done, modern CPU that are in your computer, they need to do it all in the exact same way.
They still need to
Not
support
like,
it.
like even if you have a deviation, like in once in a million, right? Like your computer is doing billions of computation per second, right? So once in a million, it's like 1,000 times per second, right? So
Yeah.
the thing needs to be like exactly the same. So this weird instruction that they added in the 80s because it's thought that it was a good idea and it turns out it's an horrible idea. Every single CPU since then has to do it the exact same way, right?
Ooh.
And the baggage
So, yeah,
of that is like managing that is extremely difficult.
So in other words, you're saying like the protocol level is, equivalent to how the CPU should work. And in every single computer for all time, basically, that's the level of
Because
base layer.
that's the common lingo that everything on the system shares, like your wallet and the smart contract and the node software and the mining software, like all of that, they speak that language. And so every time that you change that language, you have an impact on all those stuff. And because they need to understand what happened historically, they basically need to understand like all the variation of the language that exists now, but that have existed through time. And so you want to be very careful with that because that's a cost that you're imposing on the whole ecosystem, right? So the more of that you do, and the more difficult it is for anyone to join the ecosystem and actually like interact with it in a meaningful way.
Okay.
Yeah,
That
and
makes sense.
I was actually quite critical of that when that happened on Bitcoin Cash. I mean, I always wanted to add more opcodes, which is like the node also has like its own language, so to speak, and it is actually an instruction set. So the analogy there works quite well, right? We have the same instruction set. And now Bitcoin Cash added a whole lot of new instructions, which are actually very specific to their format. So and we were like, is this a good idea or not? Like, does it add something big? And there you could make the argument that, yeah, well, the downside is that you have to support these instructions forever. So if you are like not 100% sure that these really you really want to support those basically till the end of time or till the end of your blockchain, then you should be reluctant to do those. So I mean, like that's why I didn't add any of those to Lotus, even though we changed a whole bunch of stuff. That was something where we're like, okay, we need to be sure that we want to support this.
Well, I don't want to talk about problems with eCash. I really want to talk about the problems with Bitcoin. Because this is something where, I think you've made this argument to me. By the way, I want you to go ahead and make that argument again for everybody else about why you think Bitcoin is basically controlled right now the same way the gold market is basically controlled, because basically anyone who knows anything about the gold market knows that the price is not set by the market, it's set in London. And so it seems like we're with this hodl activity or this almost like a perverse incentive that's been developed in Bitcoin. It seems to have already centralized this market into being controlled by the government, basically. Or at least if it were, if the government was secretly, like centralizing the Bitcoin market, I don't know how it would be behaving any differently than it is right now. Which is which is worrisome to me, and you've kind of made a whole bunch of good arguments about this, Toby. That kind of made me really rethink owning Bitcoin.
So yeah, so there's a few things there. So first of all, it seems like due to the incentive model in Bitcoin, where like developers don't get rewarded for writing software. At least not the software that is good for the ecosystem as a whole. What they do get rewarded for is some private interests, right? So what happened, and this was pretty much predictable, is that private companies, for example, Blockstream and others, were starting to build software that kind of relied on Bitcoin not functioning properly, because then they had something that they could fix. So what they didn't do is like scale
Mhm.
Bitcoin, right? They did something else. They made like a side chain that they controlled, things like that. And I mean, and you can't really blame them, right? Like they
Of
have no
course, it's
incentive
incentives.
to, right? Like they're just following their incentives.
This is
Like
what they're getting paid to do. You can't
yeah,
blame people for doing what they're getting paid to do.
yeah, and
You
it's the
can, but
same,
like not really.
and it's the same thing
Yeah,
with the
no, if you want people,
CBDC. Yeah,
if you
go
want
ahead.
people to behave in a different way, you need to reward them for
Exactly.
a different behavior, right?
You
Like,
pay them to do it. This my brilliance with the anti-taxes that, I don't know if you're familiar with my anti-tax of the idea of how would you run a government without taxation at all. And it kind of goes on this idea that, hey, you can have these sovereign wealth funds at the local level, and that because it works here in America. I don't know if it's going to work in Europe because you guys don't really have that local government sort of thing. But or at least those are not different institutions, I should say, not meaningfully different. And but here at the here in the United States, we have local governments that have basically taxes, 8 to 14 months of taxes on hand that they've already collected. So we're not talking about new taxation. We're talking about what do we do with the old taxation? My idea was, hey, why don't we put this into like investable assets, investment grade assets, and that generate a return, and that then you can use that return on investment to pay for the government instead of direct taxation. You can use compounding interest to let it grow over time to eventually the point where you will no longer need direct taxation. You can still have it on as a supplement, but you would no longer need it then. But the idea here is now I've turned the system. This is why I call it the anti-taxes. You've effectively turned the incentives of taxation on its head. To where now I'm incentivized to be now I have down at the local government level, they're really incentivized to be really good governments who are not trying to fuck with the economy, not trying to over-regulate, not trying to to be corrupt and all of that. And this is going to and there's ways to hook this thing. You can't do it at the state level. You cannot do it at the federal level. It only works at the local government level because there's competition there, because there's 20,000 of them inside of the United States, and they typically have like virtually identical taxation levels just because of the strict competition, because it's really easy for me to move my house or my business from 4 or 5 miles to the next jurisdiction who treats me nicely. And so because of that, you have high competition there that will actually force the system to work. Whereas if you're like, oh, if there's only 50 states and only one federal government, that's not nearly enough competition. That's not going to work. And so, but by doing these incentives, this way you actually pay at least your local government, and there's other ways to hook it up to those higher levels of government. But where you would get basically the same effect. You're paying the politicians to do a good job instead of a bad job. And and by rewarding them this way, you get around a lot of the really bad effects of democracy, the bad incentives of democracy, and you get around a lot of the bad incentives of just states who are monopolies on violence. And and I always make this point that, hey, people will do whatever you pay them to do. If you tell the politicians that they only need 50% plus one, then they will be as divisive as they can to get it exactly at 50% plus one, because that's all they need to do to win. There's no reward for getting more votes. There's only a reward for getting it 50% plus one. So what are they going to do? They're going to be really, really divisive. So you're like, why are we so divided as a nation? Well, you're paying the politicians to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. So, like how about we change the payment system to where we're no longer rewarding politicians simply for dividing us again and pitting us against each other? What if we had a system of taxation that actually paid them to, be less evil, and at least, less evil. And so, you could mitigate the damage. It's it's never going to correct it all the way, but you can mitigate the damage. And I see this this stuff that you guys are doing with these cryptocurrencies as a kind of a how would you correct the incentives of the monetary system, because like the anti-tax is purely fiscal side, whereas like the crypto is like monetary side. This is how the monetary system works, and all of its perverse incentives, which are like legend. And it seems like Bitcoin has not corrected all of these. And Toby's just started to elaborate on it. But yeah, you can go ahead and respond to any of that. I see you like getting ready.
Yeah,
because
on the anti-tax. I want to see a view on the anti-tax.
no, so I'm a bit doubtful of this. It kind of remind me of a quote. I have no idea who said that, but it's like if policemen understood the law, they'd be lawyers, right? And
say again, if
policemen understood the law,
well,
understood the law,
they don't have that sound.
They'd be lawyer. They
French.
wouldn't be policemen, right? and in the same way, like if government appointee, they were good at finance, they'd be working in finance, they wouldn't be like government appointee. So in that sense, I'm not sure it's gonna work, but regardless, it's probably gonna work better than whatever is now. Like your
well, that's my point, is that
decisiveness, for instance, is
really, I think
really
Andrew's reply would be that you would get people who are good with finance then.
That's also possible.
Well, even
incentive,
right there, it's like, even if I still get the people who are just have IQs barely above chimpanzees, it's like, okay, they're still going to be behaving the same set of incentives, and they might end up being they're still like basically barely like sub-retard IQs, but they're still going to be behaving the incentives as best they can with sub-retard IQs. And so my idea is, okay, as long as you're paying it, I'm going to get a much closer result. I'm paying them to do action X. They're always going to try to value maximize. So let's change the criteria for what's the Nash equilibrium for value maximization. It's all game theory. It's like, okay, well, where is it? Where's the Nash equilibrium right now? Where do I want it to be, and how do I get it there? And that's what I'm trying to do with the anti-tax, is move that Nash equilibrium from purely counterproductive to somewhat productive.
Fair enough. I was playing devil's advocate, and I have my doubt that it would work well, but on the other hand, I have very little doubt that it would work better than whatever we have now.
Exactly. And so, and I see like the same thing with the monetary system. It's like, there's no doubt in my mind that Bitcoin would be a much better monetary system, but there's also okay, well, how do we actually make it, not just better, but best? And this is where I think you guys have a lot to talk about.
About the Bitcoin one, there is a lot of doubt in my mind, and not specific to Bitcoin. That would be to Ethereum as well, and to most of the crypto that are out there. And this is because they don't scale very well. And
can you define scaling?
Yeah, so they keep having the same property as more and more people use them. Right. This is what I like. At least in that
basically
context,
it still works if a shit ton of people work it, like it.
Yeah, exactly. So
doesn't change.
It's deeper than it looked like it is, right? Because what we've seen happening over the past 5 to 7 years, I'd say, in the crypto space, is that we started getting the roof a little, right? Like we're starting to hit a point where the system starts to degrade, where more people use it. And so what's happening, because like the crypto market has grown anyway, right, over the past 7 years. So where are those people go? Where do those people go if the system cannot grow? Well, it's because they don't use the system directly. They use the system through intermediaries, and then intermediary aggregate the actions of all their users, and then they they publish that on the system itself, right? So like, to take an example, let's say, like, there is no way to do any more transaction, right? But maybe you, Andrew, you can have like 100 people that report to you, and they tell you what transaction they are doing, and at the end of the day, you, Andrew, are gonna do like one transaction that like sum up the end result of all those transactions that the people that report to you are doing. But in doing so, we've made the system scale, but we've made the system working exactly the same way than the system that we had before. Because now, Andrew, in that example, you effectively become the bank. And And this is what we see in the current crypto system. We have banks, they are not called banks, but they are Coinbase and they are Binance and Bitfinex and whatever, you know, like FTX and whatever, like
Yeah,
all those
Coinbase is basically JP Morgan now.
Yeah, all those institutions, they are the banks of crypto. And to interact with the system, you basically have to go through them, or you have to pay like a $30 fee to do it, which, I mean, if it's really important, you can still do it, right? But if you have like 10x the number of users, it's just going to be like effectively impossible to do it for any normal person. And this is where we're going. And I think this is quite brilliant. Like if I was from the old world and I wanted to limit the impact of Bitcoin on my stuff, this is exactly what I would do, because attacking it is very difficult. It's a very resilient system, right? And subverting Bitcoin, it's gonna be really, really difficult. So I can just let people go through intermediary and I can circumvent the intermediary instead. And that is very easy, right?
Correct.
Because this is already done effectively, like for banks and stuff like that. So that's the same situation. I'm an authority in any kind of government in any country. I know to do that. And if really needs be, I can do it, right? So
this is exactly what China did, by the way.
The whole ecosystem kind of like removed the biggest freedom argument that they had going for it to begin with.
Well, and yeah, I mean, I like what you said right there, because if you're a, China's like the first one to do a CDBC. And so what was the first thing they did was they didn't try to ban Bitcoin or anything, because God knows they can't. What they did was they banned Coinbase and all of the intermediaries, and because that was the target, because that was what made it functional. That was what there was the exchanges that made it scale. So you took out so they immediately shot the scaling mechanism, because that's the human in the loop that they can actually shoot. and so this is actually, it's not just
CDBC. It doesn't have that problem, and you know why? Because the government doesn't want to be controlling the bank. Like right now, the government does control the bank because this is the only way it has to control the whole financial system, right? But if you can get rid of the bank and be directly in control, that's even better. Like you don't want to be the puppeteer if you can be yourself in control of the stuff. And what you're gonna see with CDBC, like the bank, I think the banks overall, they have not realized what's upon them, but they are going to be the first victim of that before the people.
This is actually another thing I wanted to ask you guys about, because I was thinking through, like, if I were the banks and I see this thing, there's no way they can't see this coming down the pike. And, and
you don't know. You don't know the
I think like
system.
how, if I do assume that they're smarter than me, how would I do it? If I see this is coming, this is the writing is on the wall. How do I protect myself? The way I would do it is I would be lobbying for, okay, yeah, you're going to have an account at the Federal Reserve, but this account is not going to be managed by the Federal Reserve. It's going to be managed by a secondary intermediary institution, which is me. And so this way I still got myself in the loop. I still got my thing. Maybe it's going to be a little less of a thing than it used to be, because because basically the banks right now are like the printing press here in America, and they basically have their own printing presses. And so that they're going to lose that, but they're still going to have that customer facing aspect to where, and this actually seems to work out even better for the government, because now there's actually a second layer of plausible deniability, to where it's not the Federal Reserve that's canceling you, it's JP Morgan Chase that's canceling you. So there's some plausible deniability there. And so if you're like some right winger that they don't like, now they have a way of getting you without being the ones who actually pull the trigger on you. And I would see this as a win-win, because my value prospect as JP Morgan to the government is, hey, I'll go cancel Nick Fuentes for you, and your value prospect to me is that you still keep me in the loop in this new system where technically the account is at the Fed, but now Mr. JP Morgan is going to be the one who manages it at my bank, and this gives an extra layer of plausible deniability in the loop. So if anything goes wrong, it's not their problem, not you. And because this is something you like to see with a republic, is a way of shoving blame somewhere else. The whole point of having a decentralized government is that you can point the finger in every single direction, and it's a way of dispersing blame while concentrating power. So.
Yeah, and I think you're correct. I think this is probably what it's going to look like. But for the bank, it's not a very good prospect, right? Because the bank is not going to be just like a puppet. Like it's going to be a facade, but none of the system belong to them. But where I would disagree is that I don't think the banks are seeing. I don't think the bank are seeing it at all right now, and the reason is. And it does make sense. Like banks are very optimized businesses in many ways, right? And they have their receipts that they apply, and where they can deploy them in like every single branch in like everywhere in the country, and for some banks in many different countries. And it all works the same. They have the whole same way of calculating various stuff. And because this, receipt is like so repeatable and so expandable, you can also have it have it executed by people that are not very smart or anything, right? They just know to follow instruction. And effectively, if you go into like pretty much any bank nearby where you live, and you ask the people that work there, like, what is money? None of them is going to be able to give you an answer. None of them. They don't know what is money. They know the procedure and how to operate the bank and all of that. And it's been the same way for decades. And so all those procedures, they are like very, very finely tuned and very, very well optimized. And they scale very, very well. But the problem with that is that if you have a fundamental shift in the way things are, this type of organization is not going to see it, and it's going to be very difficult to turn around. Let me take an example that is maybe more palpable to people. Like the equivalent of what banks are doing is effectively like what McDonald's is doing for food, right? They have a bunch of restaurants everywhere, and every single stuff that they do in the kitchen is codified very, very precisely, like up to the gesture that you need to make to put salt on the fries, right? Like they do it like you do this gesture, and this is how you put salt on the fry. And everybody in every McDonald's is doing it the exact same way. And all of that is very, very well optimized, right? So as a result, they study the kitchen, they see like what kind of dishes they can optimize, and then they teach everybody. And additionally, you can hire any random people and teach them those gestures and those procedures, and they can operate in the McDonald's kitchen and produce food, right? The problem is that if tomorrow there is no potatoes, for instance, like, I don't know, there is a disease, all the potatoes in the world die. Like, there is no way those people in the McDonald's are going to be able to improvise another dish that don't involve making fries, right? Because this is all they know to do. But like a high-end kitchen with a very highly skilled chef is going to be able to do something else, right? Because the chef has a deep understanding of food and how to cook and all of that. But the McDonald's guys doesn't, right? So they are going to be completely.
Also, a perfect analogy is like, that's like fiat food.
Fiat food.
It really is fiat food instead of real food.
Yeah, and the banks are really the same way. They have a bunch of tailors that know all the procedure and the different paper and regulation,
and even the higher ups, because that's where like the resistance would come from. But even they have like their procedures, like they're like, oh, we have to get this through compliance and stuff, and like, oh, we don't know if we can like talk against the CBDC or whatever. Like they would be very, very reluctant to do anything.
Yeah, and the thing is, there are probably some people in the organization that see it, right? Because not everybody in the banks is a moron, right? So some people see it, but there are not going to be
some of them,
able
I guess, are
to
good
turn
people.
the organization around. This is just like too difficult. So as a whole, those organizations, I think they don't see what's coming.
Possibly, but you really only need a few of them at the top to do it. Yeah, it's only that's the only people you actually need. And
no.
Well,
no,
I'm thinking is
because you have all those people, like you have many thousands of people that don't know to operate. So even if the CEO realize what's going on and devise a plan, he has no ability to execute because nobody under him understand what they're supposed to do.
Kinda, but at the same time, you can, with a corporation, you can centrally plan it to some, to a very high degree. And what I'm thinking is because with the Federal Reserve, not a lot of people know this, but because it is a private institution, the actual owners, the shareholders of the Federal Reserve are the big banks. And so if the Federal Reserve is, doing this partnership in Boston with MIT to get this paper done, you can bet that they ran it by their actual shareholders, who are the big banks first. And and I'm thinking like, okay, I can see how like the C-suite would see something like this coming and would be trying to develop a new system for, how we're going to integrate it with ourselves and how we're going to do it our way instead of, the way that's not good for us. And
yeah, it's probably more likely that the C-suite has an exit plan though, where they are going to be in the new boat that is better than the old boat, right? But everybody in the bank.
Your middle and lower management are going to be, they're going to get the axe, but that's their problem. Whereas like your, but your C-suite, like they're the guys who are in charge, and I can definitely see how they're going to be knowing what's going on. And we saw this in an episode a while back where I was calling it trans QE because it's a banker bailout that doesn't identify as a banker bailout. Back in not 2019, where we were having that repo, it was called repo madness. I called it trans QE, the first day it happened, immediately you had, it came out that, oh yeah, we had a phone call with all of the CEOs of the major banks, with Chairman Powell, like the next day, at 8 a.m., to say, hey, what happened here? And and so it's like they're all clearly in communication, and they're all like very much on like a first name basis. And I guess again, like this is like the CEO of the Federal Reserve talking to his bosses, who are the shareholders of who were his shareholders. And there's basically an impromptu shareholder meeting, and there's only a few of them, so it makes it real simple. And instead of thousands of them like you would be in a normal company. And so like I can definitely see like, okay, if the Boston Fed is partnering with MIT to do something like this, it's definitely been run by the Fed's shareholders, who are like the bankers, the real banksters. And so like whatever system comes out of this is going to be one that incorporates at least at least your C-suites of the former banks, and somehow buys them into the new system. So but getting back to Bitcoin, because now that whatever system is coming down the road is going to clearly need to push the Coinbases and everything else out of the way. How do you guys get around that with your coins? Like to where like you guys, how would you scale yourselves up without the exchanges? How would you get adoption without the exchanges, et cetera, et cetera?
I mean, adoption without the exchanges is actually probably easier than with it. And like, if you look at Bitcoin historically, it's how it happened, right? Like there was up to 2015 or so, there was a lot of adoption and people were transacting like directly one-to-one with those new systems. It's only after 2015 that you started hitting scaling limit that you see those exchanges and stuff like that, right? So those are not helping the system to scale so much as they are absorbing the overflow of the system.
Would you say scaling. That number go up is a symptom of bad scalability?
No,
like the number go up phenomenon.
No, but number go up has always existed in Bitcoin, right? And what is new and groundbreaking in Bitcoin is that you have a system that has hard money property, so number go up, right?
Yeah,
that is also a good medium of exchange, because like if you rewind The whole reason we have the whole financial system that we have to begin with is because we don't have a technology that is a good store of value, number go up kind of stuff. That is also a good medium of exchange, right? So rewind back like 500 years, 600 years, something like that. People trade around the Mediterranean and they use gold, right? Because this is all like those small nations everywhere. They don't have any common currency. They use gold. But now what happens? You need to transport gold on your ship through the Mediterranean. Maybe your ship is gonna sink. It's now even more expensive than
it's Turkish pirates all over the place,
because you lose all your money. Additionally, you may get robbed at the other end, and or you're gonna like recover your stuff because it's in another country. You know, you speak the language there, and there is no telephone, right? So this is a huge problem, right? So what do? You go to a bank where you live, you put your gold at the bank, and the bank gives you some kind of receipt. Hey, this dude has, you know, that amount of gold at the bank. And then you travel with your good in another country, you sell it, and you trade those paper from the various banks, right? And at the end of the day, you can get back your gold from the bank with all the paper you've traded with other people. So that the gold actually doesn't move for the most part. And when there is a big imbalance between several banks, they're going to do like one shipment that is very, very highly secured. That is much more secure than you going around with your gold on you, right? And then, you know, like from there, the whole financial system start to develop. The reason why this whole stuff exists to begin with is because you don't have a hard money that also have good medium of exchange properties, right? And Bitcoin always had this hard money property with number go up. Like that's something it has since inception. What changed is not that it gained that somehow, it's that it lost the ability to be a good medium of exchange. And so as a result, it's very similar to gold. And they say it's digital gold, right? So it's not completely random, right? But gold is where we started. And now people are building a ton of tools on top of it that are effectively recreating the whole financial system, where now we don't have banks, we have exchanges, but they are banks, right?
They serve the same function. Whereas like silver, which was, mined in Spain a lot, actually, right? Yeah, right next to France. By the way, this is why France got invaded by Rome all the time was because they had to get to Rome had to get from from the Italian peninsula to Iberia back then is what it was called, because they had so many silver mines right there, because silver ended up being a much better medium of exchange because it's far more plentiful, and it was like the common person's money. Like if you were a big bank or a big government, you would use gold as like a major thing for major transactions. You would not use it for like day-to-day exchange. You would use silver for that. And that's why the denarius in Rome was made of silver, not, well, originally. It didn't end that way.
Yeah, then there was less and less silver in it.
Yeah. And this was why they had so many wars, was they were mainly trying to find silver because, again, Gresham's law. And so that they couldn't pay their troops, they couldn't pay and stuff, and so you have to send that to get invade other places to get the silver or the gold as a way of maintaining the system. And so what they've done now is they by having something that's far too scarce and is not easily gotten, is not easily mined, like silver and gold. You have to mine them, and there's only so much, and a deposit will run dry, and then you have a problem, and you need a steady supply coming onto the market at basically all times. And so otherwise you have to go to wherever it is and get it. And this is what gave us so many wars with with Rome going north into Gaul as well, for the same exact reason.
This is true, but that doesn't really apply to Bitcoin, though. Like even the modern version of Bitcoin, because it's basically infinitively divisible, right? Well, not infinitely, but like for all practical purposes,
Yeah.
it's infinitely divisible. And well, you could say, well, gold, you can technically divide it, through like up to the size of one atom of gold, right? But like it's completely
Yeah.
impractical. I'm not gonna trade one atom of gold with someone else. Like I'm not even gonna trade like micrograms of gold with someone else. Completely impractical. So but I can trade, like satoshis, which is like the base unit of Bitcoin, and it's
Yeah. Well, the issue that they have is that when you have when you end up with debt, you always have a problem where there's more that basically there's more demand than there's supply. Like definitionally, there's all with a loan-based system, there always has to be more more demand than supply. And so that gives you the main problem. And so this is why you always need something, that a currency that has a steady supply coming onto it, but preferably is not controlled by the state, because we know how fiat works out. And they will definitely abuse a system when they're the ones printing it. Or coining it, I should say. I mean, this is where you get the idea of defacement, because they would literally cut the face off of the coin in order to get more of the coin or whatever, get more silver back. And so you need a system that can give you new supply without it being in charge of the government. And what I see with Bitcoin is, again, this is gold. This is digital gold, not digital silver, where you have it is completely scarce, and eventually that's going to become a problem. But you could theoretically get around that with a new system, like by just taking the cap off. And I think that that would definitely have to happen.
Well, let me go in a.
But I see that right there as an issue that is going to okay, once there's that chaos, once there's that demand where it has to happen, I see that as a potential exploit in the system. That's just an exploit waiting to happen. Go ahead, take it away, Toby.
So there's this like a lot of the memes in Bitcoin are actually like not that true. So for example, the 21 million Bitcoin, like every time like Bitcoin already forked, right? Like we had Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. And then basically what happened, instead of having 21 million coins, you had 42 million coins as supply cap, right? Because you basically doubled the amount of coins. Yes, the amount of hash rate that is totally on the network remained the same. The amount of attention that was totally on both networks remained the same. The amount of money probably roughly stayed the same. It probably went down even a little, right? Because of people not getting things right. And then again, Bitcoin Cash forked into Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin SV, and then later Bitcoin Cash forked again into Bitcoin Cash and eCash. So every time you add another 21 million coins into the entire system. So this idea of, oh no, like there will only ever be 21 million coins of that, it already is no longer true. And I don't see why this process would stop at some point. Like as long as you have an incentive to fork the chain, and with the example of eCash, there was like a humongous incentive to do that change, because like Amaury wanted to eat, I guess, and so that'll I don't see why that wouldn't be the case. And but there's still like the value of the coin comes from the amount of attention you can focus on it. And there's the Metcalfe's law. Metcalfe's law, yeah. If you like it'll go up almost exponentially. Not exponentially, no, quadratically.
Yes, exponentially.
Yeah,
it's proportional. Sorry. Yeah, the value is proportional to the number of basically your active daily users.
So be careful with that.
Your value of a network is basically its active daily users, and you use this law to evaluate like social media companies as well. So it's not just true for Bitcoin and crypto, which are just payment networks. It's also true for like telephone companies. And this is where we figured it out, is for like telephone companies and for social media companies. This is how you evaluate how valuable is the network. And then once you have that top value, well, then you you can basically divide it out over, well, how many coins, are in the network, et cetera. And that's how you can get your, kind of what you think the price should be. And, and it kind of just makes logical sense. Well, if I can't, if I can have this payment system, but I can't send it to you because you're not on the network, then that payment system is less valuable because I need it, because the thing I need it for is to send value to you. And so the more people there are on the network, the more valuable it is, because I can send that, because now I have, more nodes that I can send that value to. And this is approximately seems to be how the dollar seems to work as well, that it gets more valuable the more people who are using it. And it seems like it has the exact same property as a network. And so so therefore any I mean, this is where we get back to the adoption conversation is, hey, that, the adoption is what makes the thing valuable. Is that, again, that's just kind of, ontological, that, hey, demand makes it valuable. Value is subjective for that exact reason.
I'm not sure what the question is.
I thought Amr, you wanted to say something on the coin thing, like the number of coins in the system. And
so that's an argument. I was thinking about that, but not in the exact same way, because you have to use intermediary. You have no idea what the supply actually is, right? Because they can create a lot of thin air, and it happened many times in the past. It's almost certain that it's happening now, right?
Basically fractional reserve banking, but on the exchanges.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like the exchange, they can create coin out of thin air, and they actually have an incentive to do so, right? Because practically speaking, they can solve liquidity issue that way. They can emmagazinate trading fees and all of that. And because most of the people are gonna keep their asset on the exchange anyway, it's okay, it works right? But all those virtual Bitcoin that don't exist on the chain, they participate in the price action of Bitcoin because they are on those exchanges and they are trading as well. So we don't know. So if we don't know how many Bitcoins there are right now. There's probably way more than 21 million, if you ask me.
And I want to kind of hear from Toby a little bit, because you got, I think one of your things with Lotus is that you're able to pay people to develop, and that it uses new coins. Is that what are like the new coins mechanisms in Lotus that
actually
solving this problem?
The same mechanism does also exist on eCash. On eCash, you have it's 8%. On Lotus, we chose that to be 50%. And so what that basically allows is that we pay directly from the seigniorage, or like the minting of new coins.
That.
So the seigniorage is it comes from French. I probably can't pronounce it, but it means that seigniorage, and it means the right of the lord to mint money, right? Like
Seigneur is lord.
And is that centrally controlled or decentralized?
So in the historical one, obviously it's in the previous version. Obviously it was like
in Lotus in Lotus, is it centrally controlled?
In Lotus is well, the way it works is that someone publishes code. So on eCash you would publish code, we would publish code, and then people can choose to run the software or not. So so it isn't like we can't force anyone to run it. Of course, there has to be some kind of decision making where the money goes, right? So that's the on eCash they have the GNC.
This seems like a counter incentive to forking it. It seems like it counters that incentive. Now you're keeping. The reason you would fork a code is that you can't develop this thing on it. And whereas this seems like a mechanism for incorporating new pieces of code into itself.
Yeah, and also you have much more, like you can basically pay people who want to do their own thing through the seigniorage in order to be like, hey, stay on our chain, you make our thing more valuable. Whereas on Bitcoin, that thing doesn't exist, right? Like on Bitcoin, there's nobody who has the okay, like who can pay people to stay on there, because like it's it's a thing that you just acquire and wait for it for the value to go up. So what we can do on Lotus, and we also see that on eCash, is that you can fund different projects through the minting of new coins. So the way it works more technically is that in the transaction that generates new coins, which is called the Coinbase, that's actually where the company got its name from. So but the original term comes from this specific transaction, Coinbase. And that basically, it doesn't, like, no coins go into that transaction, and only coins go out of that transaction. So basically it's generating coins out of thin air. And that is basically the way that's the way new Bitcoins are created. That's like
elaborate on that. Elaborate on that. That's really important.
Yeah. So somehow you have to create coins, right? Like you can't start Bitcoin and there's no coins, and like how would that? Like I can't even fathom how that would work. Like you would just mine blocks, but there's nothing in there. So you have to start from somewhere. So the way Satoshi made it, and I think it's a really cool way, is that like every transaction in Bitcoin in a block is exactly the same, except for the first one. The first one is special, right? This is the Coinbase. So this is just like a rule, right? There's no like you could ask like, okay, why is that? It's just like, no, we because we said so, right? We say so. The first transaction in the block creates new coins, right? And it also collects the transaction fees. So all the transaction fees which are paid in all the transactions, they don't go anywhere. They actually basically within a transaction, they just vanish. You just like they have no output. But what the miner can then do is they can be like, okay, I see there's a bunch of coins which didn't go anywhere. I collect those, right? And that's also a rule we just say, right? And then what happens? You have a transaction, and there's no like account from, right? It doesn't say, okay, this money is coming from. There's only a account going to, right? And since it is the first transaction in the block, we say, okay, this transaction can do that. And then we calculate, okay, what's the maximum it can take from the system? Like what's the maximum it can generate from the system? I mean, so on Bitcoin, like it started being 50 Bitcoin per block you can generate. If you went with 51 Bitcoin, your entire block would be invalid, and all the proof of work you did, all the mining would be for the garbage, right? But if you went for 50, you can also go for 49. Some miners actually did that. They went for they didn't mine some coins that they could have, right? Basically like destroying the coins. But yeah, so that's the Coinbase. Does it make sense?
Yeah. And so now like Coinbase, how are they able to use that in ways that other people can't?
So I mean, it's very similar to a normal transaction, but the way they can use that is just to like generate new coins, right? Like that's the way you can use that. Basically, you say, okay, like if you have like a wire transfer, you have account from and an account to, but here you don't have an account from, you just have an account to. And the way you do that is you just the miner just specifies their own account there, right? They say, okay, this money goes to my address.
Well, actually, they can send it anywhere, right?
Yeah, they can send it anywhere.
If they feel generous, they can donate it to anyone that they want.
Which was some people wanted to fund the coins there. It's like, oh, like we just donate to some fund or whatever. But what then eCash and Lotus added is that we added a Coinbase rule, right? We call it the Coinbase rule, where there's another requirement on the Coinbase is that a certain percentage of the maximum allowed Coinbase value has to go to specific other addresses, right? For eCash, that is for like the ABC address. They have some address, which is multi-sig. We don't know who that is. The money goes there, and then they spend that for development purposes, right? So that goes for hiring people, that goes for developing stuff, that goes for I think also partially for marketing, right? Because you need to market that somehow. But I don't know the internals of that. And for Lotus, we have the same thing, right? It's like, okay, 50% of all the newly minted coins have to go to a specific list of addresses that that are specified in the consensus rules, right? And we specifically put those into the consensus rules because like that allows people to opt out, right? If they're like, wait a second, this is like total, this is where like you don't have these corruption, like the corruption mechanisms are very, very different. Because if people are like, they vehemently disagree with the way these funds are going, then like they have to actually opt in. They have to be like, okay, I'm going to follow. I'm going to follow that, and by default they will actually not follow that. So this way you avoid, like you actually have to convince people to go with the update. And this way you have a very well functioning funding mechanism.
So in other words, it's not just a consensus mechanism, it's a consensus building mechanism.
Yeah, it incentivizes building consensus. Like,
okay,
right?
That's
something
like, you don't have in normal democracies. Is you don't have this is where the parties, they function as consensus building mechanisms, and we've seen how that goes because those
you have to have 100%.
based.
Like you can't have 51%. You have to have 100%, right? And if you don't have that, you go separate ways. It would be like a secession, right? So it would be like, okay, Texas is now an independent country, because they don't follow the consensus rules anymore. And that's the same thing that happened with Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. Like basically they seceded entirely from Bitcoin, because you always have to have literally everyone on board. Like if a single byte is different, then you're no longer on board. But
so in other words, what you're saying is that Bitcoin is like the Protestant version of crypto, and you guys are the Catholic version of crypto.
Well,
the Germans,
some people
and the
try
Frenchies
to make actually the opposite argument, that like Bitcoin is the Catholic version because they like are a true chain.
The one true faith and all that.
Yeah, and the like Bitcoin Cash and eCash and BSV, they're like the Protestant ones, because they like branched out into like this whole explosion of like, oh no, we're the real one, but they like changed the rules because like, no, these are the real rules, right? Like, we have to change these rules. And
as the theologian and system thinker, I would say that, okay, well, the Catholic version is the one that builds consensus and prevents the schisms from happening. Whereas like, if you look at like, like Orthodoxy, you get schisms all over the place. Protestantism, don't even get me started, because there's no consensus building mechanisms in either of those. Whereas the Catholic Church has been very, very resilient against against schisms. They still happen, but but when they do, they tend to like decompose, basically. I mean, if the Protestantism is the body of Christ, well, that body is decomposing because it's like 37,000 and counting. This is why I say, okay, that Bitcoin had something unstable about it, because it schismed so many times, and what it didn't have was a consensus building mechanism, which I think you guys have kind of tried to build into yours, which is why I'm saying, okay, it sounds like you guys are the Catholic version, finally came along after the Protestant version.
In that story, we are almost 2,000 years ago, right? Like that's where it starts. And if you want to go there, at the time there were like a fracton of different prophets that each of them are kind of at their own, like variation of the faith. And
you had the Paulines and the Petrarchs, basically the Peters and the Pauls. They were two types of Christianity.
But even then there are many of them that are not that relevant today anymore. Or I just like mentioned en passant, in the Bible, but never like really cared for or whatever. It was just like a thing that was happening at the time, and we know of the one that caught, right? But even at the time, the Catholic Church was not like, it was not a big thing. It was a few dudes that believe in their own stuff, and it took a few hundred years before before it became big. So if you want to go in that analogy, like many people are like, with the Protestant and the Christian and whatnot, but I would put BTC as the Jewish faith, effectively.
That's a different way of thinking about it.
Well, first because like it's the original one, right? And
that's actually a really
even
good
more
way
than
to
that.
think
Like the Jewish tradition is to not change the rule at all very much, right?
Yeah.
They can make new rules, but the new rules have to fit within
They
the
have to be
old rule,
abrogated,
right?
basically.
Right? You cannot really change the old rule. You can make new rules, but they have to be made in such a way that they fit within the old rules, like they don't contradict the old rules. And this is 100% what BTC is doing, right? Like with their
Soft
policy
fork.
of having
I
soft
could
fork
see that.
only,
I could see that too.
they
Because
are
they're like
doing
God's chosen
exactly that.
people.
And then you have people like Jesus that come along, and what he's saying is that it's not like respecting the exact rule that is important. It's more respecting the spirit of the rule that is important, right? Like we need to figure out
it's the meta
what
rule.
was like, what was the intention behind those rules, because like the word is changing, and so the application of the rule may be changing, but we need to understand, like what are the underlying
that's why he points out that the greatest commandments are the meta rules. Love God first, and then love your neighbor as yourself. These are number 1 and number 2, because these are the meta rules that all of the other rules are derived from. And so yes, as the meta rule, it's the meta rule you need to be following, which is like the spirit of the rule, as you're saying. And so I like this analogy too, because you see this with like the real hardcore Bitcoin community, to where they're basically, it's the God's chosen people, like so to speak, and they have that attitude about them. And whereas and it seems like it's funny because in this thing, it went from the Jewish religion to the Protestant religion first, and then the Protestants ended up giving birth to the Catholics this time around with the Bitcoin analogy.
Yeah, there is a bit of a flipperoo, I think, but
it's not a perfect analogy, but it really seems to work that way really well. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, I think it's a very good analogy. In many ways, it's very similar. There are obviously differences, right? Like the story is not exactly the same, but many of the patterns are very much the same.
And you even get like Bitcoin Satoshi Vision, which is basically similar to let's say Jehovah's Witness or something, where they're like, we are the one true faith, like we're the one true Christianity. And obviously one true Christianity is Lotus. But we but we have with BSV, they are like, they actually actively rolled back changes that were added later on during Bitcoin's history to get as close as possible to whatever Satoshi released in a version. Like they're always talking about, like,
it's very arguable because
that's like their intention, right? That was like the intention, but like
that's what they're going for. Well, that's not what they do.
Yeah, I would probably agree with that. I mean, at some point I stopped paying attention. I stopped paying attention at some point because like, okay, this is just like stupid.
But they're changing a bunch of stuff all the time, and they always say like they are changing stuff so that nothing changes. Like that's basically the whole story. It's kind of weird, but that's very interesting. And yeah, like the comparison with Jehovah's Witnesses is actually pretty great.
Yeah, they're the Aryans, so but like yeah, we can call them heretics and excommunicate them. We're fine. This is the Catholic group, so anyway.
Not really. Like one of the big innovation of the Catholic branch in that whole stuff. Like one is like the spirit of the law is more important than the law, effectively, right? If I can say it that way. But a second one is that there are plenty of stuff that are explicitly non-topic in like the Catholic faith. It's like there are stuff the church says that doesn't really concern the church, right? Like that's not we're not for or against that. That's your own business. That's outside of the religion, and that's very unique, actually. Like not that many religions do that. That's a very unique twist, and I think that's one of the reasons it's been much more successful than Judaism, which on the other hand is like very restrictive about who can declare themselves Jewish and all of that. Like it's like kind of a VIP club in a way. Whereas Whereas the Catholic Church is like, oh, there is a bunch of crap that we don't care about, right? So you can be like a Scandinavian person living with your like Swedish or Norwegian tradition. You can be like a Latin person living in Italy. You can be like living in Asia or whatever with a completely different tradition. And 90% of those traditions have like nothing to do with what the Catholic faith is advocating. And that makes it like very easy to integrate into existing environment. And so like you take Judaism and you put that twist, suddenly boom, it goes worldwide.
But I think that what really the difference between like why the Catholic Church really succeeded and the Orthodox Church really didn't was that the Catholic Church in the Pope, we innovated a consensus building mechanism, because what Christianity had was it had a consensus mechanism in the councils, but it did, in those ecumenical councils, that's a consensus mechanism, but it didn't have a consensus building mechanism. And so this is why it never really orthodoxy never really took off. Couple that with a whole bunch of invasions by barbarians and Muslims, and so that was another major reason it didn't happen. But the Catholic Church did, because this Pope, he ends up being, as a kind of like the vicar of Christ and all that, he ends up being a consensus building mechanism, his office at least. And not only that, but when we started having those Caesaropapism episodes where that we were having a power struggle with the state, and the state would try to be appointing the Pope, and we were like, no, fuck you. And so we, what we ended up doing to get around that was that, we had it so that all of the bishops had to be appointed by the Pope. And because of that, the Pope's going to be appointing like-minded people. And this ends up being a consensus building mechanism, because now all of the bishops are, basically their direct superior is the Pope. So anytime the state tries to come in and appoint a bishop, that the bishop can be like kind of wash his hands of it a little bit, be like, well, let me see what my higher up thinks. Hey Pope, how do you feel? Hey Pope in Rome, how do you feel about that? Oh, so no? Okay, well, sorry, sorry, Mr. States. And you end up with a Pope who's more powerful than the states. And this is why we were able to, it's this consensus building mechanism that we innovated that ended up being like the whole reason that we succeeded, and where, Protestants who reject all authority, are not, they don't have any way of doing this. And so like when you guys have a system like this, actually is not just a consensus mechanism, but a consensus building mechanism. This is something that, like historically, at least in the Catholic Church, really worked out well in history, because you can't just have a consensus mechanism, because what if people don't consent, or like, what if they don't agree? You need a way of actually bringing people together to build the consensus that, in order to make the consensus mechanism work. And this is the main difference between, again, Orthodoxy and Protestantism. Orthodoxy, they do have a consensus mechanism, but no consensus building mechanism, whereas Protestantism doesn't even have the consensus mechanism, basically. And so so they're now at both at a competitive disadvantage. Bitcoin and all of the other coins, are basically, where that's coming from. And Judaism, to carry on this analogy, doesn't have any sort of consensus mechanism at all. So where you can't even make new rules, and even if you do, they all have to fit into the same framework. You can't build anything new. So there's no innovation.
Which is why the analogy to Bitcoin works really well. And to illustrate
Islam
that
has the same feature.
Yeah, they did. Yeah. Well, there's someone making like Islam.
They've hardwired everything. There's no innovation. You've you basically, this is why Islam is stuck in the 6th century, is that they are hardwired into, you're doing it this way and there is no other way around it. And Judaism has the same exact features, why they're stuck in basically, what was it, 70 AD or something like that. They're stuck a few thousand years up prior, because there's no consensus mechanism for building anything new. That is like, it was the new Levite, since the Levites all got destroyed, basically, and we have no record of who's a real Levite and who's not. This is where you got, and when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, it destroyed all records of who's who. So now you can't have a priesthood anymore. And now so now we have to figure out a new way of doing Judaism without the Levites. And this is what they came up with. And you're still basically hardwired into it. And it doesn't work very well. And so anytime you hardwire something like what's happened with Bitcoin, hey, systems change, systems evolve, and you have new needs, and you need to be able to reinterpret the meta rules in order to make new rules that are updated. And Christianity's meta rules are, love God and love your neighbor. And so we need to be able to reinterpret those every so often as systems change and as we are more able to get closer to that ideal. And with Bitcoin, is that like they hardwired everything in, and what happens? It breaks immediately because people see ways to make everything better. That it's like the idea of, hey, money should be as good as possible, and this is not. And so now you have a protocols that have this ability to not just have consensus, but have consensus building. Those are going to be a lot more competitive than protocols that do not have a consensus building mechanism.
Yeah, though I wouldn't bet against Judaism that much. Like it clearly has its downside in some way, but it's also very clear that it's been around for like at least 5,000 years, probably more. So like it has
like
proven...
they hardwired in things that work. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so
the thing that
and they're timeless truths that they've hardwired. Yeah,
exactly. So that has some benefit, but there are also like very strong evidence that Jewish people generally do very well in all kind of various environment, even though like obviously we all know that they faced various hardship in history, and like even factoring that in, right, it kind of like destroyed many of the argument of people that are like, oh, like this group of people were traditionally oppressed and this is what they are not doing well now. Well, you look at the Jewish people, clearly that's not the case. And so very clearly they have stuff in their culture that work very well for them, right? But
it's a double-edged sword.
Growth is not one of them, right? Like it's not a contagion, like it's not an ideology that replicates itself very well. But it works, and I think we're gonna see the same with Bitcoin for the same reason. Like it's gonna be around for a very, very long time. I'm not gonna bet against it, but it's probably not gonna stay the biggest coin forever.
Oh yeah, exactly. That's kind of where it goes, because you see the exact same sort of hardwire mechanism in Islam, and it's like, okay, if you hardwire a lot, ideas that work, well, that's going to be to its benefit because you don't want those to change. But if you hardwire in a whole bunch of like, hey, you need to cut the hand off of a thief or whatever, and other stuff that really does not work, okay, well, that's going to keep you locked in the 7th century, and that's a serious issue. So it's like, okay, did you hardwire things that worked or things that didn't work? So, Judaism, they, by and large hardwired a lot of things that worked and they haven't updated them, but in Islam, you hardwired a lot of things that worked and also a lot of things that didn't work. And whereas Christianity, you've only hardwired the meta rules, not the actual rules themselves. This is a much more adaptive system that does a lot, that ends up doing a lot better than the original systems. So that's it is a little bit, it is a give and take, but we do see that, kind of both sides of the coin with the hardwiring thing. So, but yeah, I kind of agree that, hey, it's that Bitcoin, it does have that kind of, we were first to the market property where they had that first mover advantage that's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, you also that you know what you get. That nobody will fuck it up. Right? Like I have Bitcoins. I know that in 100 years, they're going to have the exact same property that they do now. Right? And that in itself, maybe those are not the best property, but the fact that I can know what they are in the 100th year, this has some value.
I see. Yeah.
Whereas with eCash, we want to do some updates or floaters, right? We already know, we know which ones we want to do, right? And I think to get back to the hardwiring of rules, I think the one thing that really broke like one of the rules that really broke Bitcoin's neck, in my view, is this 1 megabyte limit that was added like way early on in Bitcoin. So basically, the prophet of Bitcoin, right? He made all the rules. He got this big revelation. He wrote down the direct dictation by God, but he made some errors. And one of those errors was the 1 megabyte limit. And he actually added that later on. And that basically says like, oh, every block can at most be 1 megabyte in size. So 1 megabyte is 1 million bytes, right? So it's not super big. It's basically one floppy disk, if anyone remembers what that is still.
I do.
And you basically can only have those every 10 minutes. On average, you have basically 10 minutes, and every 10 minutes you get 1
That's not
megabyte.
nearly enough.
So that is not sufficient throughput. If you put those into transactions per second, that's around 7 transactions per second. If you like optimize it, sometimes it's just 4 transactions per second, even if they're full and so forth. So what then happened is that rule just like ossified, right? It's like, okay, this rule is now law, right? Like I mean, maybe Satoshi made a mistake, but some people were like, no, he didn't make a mistake whatsoever. Like this is totally.
Actually, a lot of people that were on the small block size of that debate that I've talked with, you know, and when you talk with them personally, they have a more nuanced opinion than, you know, like the bombastic stuff that you get from public PR, obviously. Many of them, they did not think that increasing the block size to 2 megabyte or even 10 megabyte would be a disaster, right? What they think would be a disaster is changing the rules, right? This is where, like, this was the important point. This was the point that nobody was talking about at the time, but this was really the dividing point. Some people were like, Bitcoin is a digital cash system with hard money properties, and we want to make it the best system of that kind that we can. And some people are like, no, like there is a set of rules, and if we start changing them, at some point we're gonna fuck it up. And so we're better off not changing them.
Yeah, that seems like a bad argument, because you have two problems there. One, nothing ventured, nothing gained, and two, if it fucks it up, you know, you're always going to go back to the prior system, because every time you have a new update, isn't that a new fork? So you know, but basically you would have to you know, if nobody liked that update, you would just kind of go back to the previous fork. Because I mean, that's their ratification mechanism.
Like for example,
there may be irreparable damage done in the meantime, right?
Yeah, there was like a inflation bug where they basically created like 18 trillion Bitcoin, and the way they resolved that is by just going back the chain and then like starting from that older state and then going forward. But this really is nothing you want to do ever, right? This is like, if you can spend a lot of money in order to avoid that, and a lot of and accept a lot of trade-offs in order to avoid that, then you really want to do that. And I think what their argument is that, no, really, like, let's just not change the rules whatsoever, then we won't ever have to do these things, right? And also another argument for that would be that like whenever you have these bugs, then you have to organize, right? You have to be like, okay, like which block do we go back to? Like when you have to do all of these things, which you wouldn't have to do otherwise. And then you could be like, oh, and then that introduces centralization, right? Because then like someone has to decide this is what's going on, right? You could make all of these arguments. I mean, but they're all, you know, I would agree that obviously you want to make changes because this is an engineering thing. This is like, this is not like a belief that like you know, I mean, it is to some extent.
No, they are making changes on the engineering front. Like the Bitcoin client that you are gonna download now is different in many ways from the one that you'd be downloading 5 years ago. But none of those changes change the rule, like the sacred rule of the system that decide what is valid and what is not valid. And
except for soft forks, but so basically it's still compatible, right? So to go to the Judaism example, so they did add new rules actually, but they are all compatible with the previous rules. So one example of that would be the Taproot thing, right? So everybody was excited about Taproot, right? Oh, Taproot is so great. And, I think Taproot is a great change. It doesn't help with electronic cash, really. Like, it doesn't improve scaling, but, whatever. But what they did is they basically said, like, oh, this type of script, previously that would just mean anyone can spend this, right? Like, you can just grab these coins. You don't have to provide any kind of cryptographic signature. And we now changed that. Now it means Taproot, like this new kind of smart contract. So basically what they did is like, hey, we have this old rule and it says you can do whatever you want, but we had a new rule. And now this means, oh, you have to follow all like this new kind of smart contract thing. And
yeah, but isn't it what Jews do, right? Because now they have a bunch of rules about using electricity, for instance, or elevators and stuff like that on Shabbat that they obviously did not have before because there was no electricity or elevators before, right?
Yeah.
So when there are new situations, like they can evolve the rules, but the thing is, like, the new rules, they must fit within the old rules, which is what soft sock are, right? So the whole stuff, I think
you can't change your first principles, basically. The first
you
principles.
can change the existing rule. You cannot change any of the existing rules. You can add new ones, but they need to be compatible with the existing one.
Yeah, basically your first principles, cannot change. Whereas like your higher, you can make a new conclusion based off your original first principles, but the original first principles themselves cannot change. But you can make new conclusions off of them, such as like, hey, no electricity on Sabbath or something like that. And
whereas for like, and one of these rules on Bitcoin was the 1 megabyte limit. Right. So when Bitcoin Cash came along, it basically broke that idea. Oh, we can't, like, all rules have to be backwards compatible. They were like, oh no, let's remove that rule. Right. We no longer want to have that.
That's a hard fork. Okay.
And that's a hard fork. Right. So they changed it to 8 megabyte limits. Later down, it was changed to a 32 megabyte limit. And every time you basically are like getting rid of a quote unquote ancient rule, or like, whatever the analogy would be.
An outdated one, yeah.
Yeah, and you're like, okay, now it's no longer you shall honor like father and
mother. It's now your father, mother, and uncle, or something like that.
No. It's just honor your father, right? So you actually make it more relaxed, basically. Not sure if this is a good example.
This old stuff remind me. There is a letter, I think, from or to John. I don't remember. There is a letter from and to John, and basically the discussion in those letters goes as, well, if we look at the laws of the ancient time, right? Like the old Jewish text, they say like it's the law that is given by God to the people. But when you look at that law, there is a bunch of stuff that look like completely barbarian and backward by even the standard of 2000 years ago when those letters were written. They were like what the fuck were they thinking? Like,
it was very progressive at the time,
right? Because like in their time, this was already thousands of years old, right? And so so those old rules, like some of them, they seem like completely outdated and backward to them. And so I don't know if it's John saying that or the person John is responding to. I don't remember, but one of the two is like, well, if you look at the ancient text, this is the law that set the people of God apart, effectively. I don't remember the exact formulation, but like something like that. This is the law that sets them apart. So what we need to be looking at in those laws is the one that are different from like the law of the land that existed at the time, right? Because this is the law that set the people apart. And so, like cutting your hand when you steal something or whatever, like those were like, stuff that everybody was doing at the time, right? So those kind of law, we shouldn't give too much credit to that, right? This is not the law that set those people apart. And the law that set those people apart, they're actually quite interesting, right? Because it's one of the things that is different is that the law is above the leader or the king or like whoever is in charge at the time, right? And right now that seems like a an idea that is mostly accepted by everybody, like even people that are not Christian in the world, mostly. At the time, that was completely revolutionary, right? Because the law was effectively whatever the king says it is, right? And so that was
like the one example of this in the Jewish law was like, hey, the idea that, hey, you're allowed to like kill your son after you give him a trial. If he's like really violent and dangerous and all that, you can kill him after he's been given a trial. But like the previous system was, you can kill either your son or your daughter with no trial. And then like that was the previous system. So like the idea that God's coming along and like it's actually a really progressive rule that he's making right there is that, okay, so daughters, that's like completely off limits now. And if you're going to kill the son, you at least have to give him a trial first. And so you can see the meta rule right there at play, where it's the idea isn't that God's condoning that you're going to be okay with like killing your son. It's that, okay, we're trying to move you closer to not killing them at all and trying to make it harder. And and this is an anarchy back then, like the law of Moses is an anarchical covenant. There is no central government to it. And so this is basically all of these laws effectively have to be enforced voluntarily. So it's like you have to write the law with that in mind, that there's no real enforcement of this. So so you would so this is how you would derive the meta rules from from what the laws actually are, and then you would reinterpret this correctly. And so like and this is how the Jews can do it. Like, okay, I have the solid meta rule, and now I can't change that.
There is another very interesting concept from there. It's the fact that the God, like God in the Bible, but even in the the Old Testament, or like all the Jewish text, is almost an algorithmic God, right? Much more like before, like the other religion that existed at the time is like the God, they do random crap, we don't understand any of it, and we're gonna like do sacrifices or whatever to make them happy in the hope that they do the right thing, right? And the Jewish God is very different. It's like, hey guys, I gave you free will, so you can do whatever you want. But if you do that, it's gonna be really bad.
He introduces the idea that, I, God, do not change. I am who am. He's saying I'm omnipresent. I do not change. So it's like, and I'm very rigid. I'm very, it's like, it's not, you need to adapt to me, not the other way around. And it's a very like new idea that like God like, is I'm not unchanging.
Gonna do random stuff.
And very logical. It's like algorithmic. I like that idea.
It's almost algorithmic. It's like, well, you're gonna do that, it's gonna be really bad, many people die. And what happened, like 9 out of 10 in the Bible or the Old Testament, people do it anyway, and many people die. And that's very interesting, because that start a bunch of ideas, probably the most important one of them being science in general, right? Because when the God do random crap that you cannot understand, then the world is just completely incomprehensible and there is no reason to do science, right? But once God lay down the rules, like here is what the rules, and if you play by the rule, it's gonna be a good time, and if you don't play by the rule, it's gonna be a bad time, right? Well, know that there are rules. I can look at the word and study it and try to figure out what are the rules of the word, and effectively I am doing science. And when you look at even what those rules are, you notice that this is patterns of behavior that are exceedingly common in large enough group of people, effectively. Like when God is saying, like, if you do X, many people will die. You can look even in the modern world, people doing X in large enough group, and like the whole group degenerate into something where there is like immense suffering. And maybe like, like a very simple one, you can say, well, there are a bunch of animals that are pure and impure in the Old Testament, right? And you're not supposed to eat the impure one. And as it turned out, bats are
those are the
one of the impure ones, right? And so you could, like, the whole past 2 years before Putin cured the COVID, before that, you could write that whole story in biblical term, right? By saying that, there were some unbelievers and they got involved with impure animals, right? And so God decided to spread some, well, not really decided, but like this is the rule, right? So when you do that, God like bring a malediction of mankind, and many people get sick and many people die, and then government goes authoritarian and start to lock people in their home and all of that. Like you can make a whole story that would be fairly similar to the story of like Moses and the Pharaoh, for instance, right? Yep. And you can write it in biblical term, and that's gonna make a lot of sense.
And it seems like that, yeah, like they really have done exactly, that they've kind of done that with with Bitcoin, to where that like they've taken instead of they took the actual rules instead of the meta rules. And the people arguing for the meta rules are the the reformers, and the people saying no, we need the original rules are your Jews in the sense.
So
I really
the
like
problem with the meta rules is that you need to understand them.
Well, it's also that like these are not divine revelation. It's also that hey, hey, these might not be complete. They might be an incomplete set, and we might actually need an additional meta rule or 3 or 4 or 5, or maybe one of the meta rules was wrong.
They actually don't tell you very much like anything that is practical. They tell you to get to the rules. They don't tell you what the rules are. And so one feature of having the rule directly is like, even if you are a complete moron, you can read the rule and respect them, and you're gonna do good, right? Whereas when you have the meta rules, it's not so obvious, right? Like suddenly you've excluded a bunch of people from being able to respect the faith effectively, or to follow it, to be able to, right? And you see that in Bitcoin discussion all the time. Most people have zero idea of how Bitcoin works and what are the ins and outs and the trade-offs and all of that, right? But on BTC, the fact that they can just like follow the rule, and the rule are not for question anyway, make it so that it doesn't matter if they are saying stuff that cannot even be true in any possible reality, right? Because they are not consistent with how the system works. It doesn't matter.
Bitcoin
right?
is a swarm of cyber hornets harnessing encrypted energy or something.
Yeah, like you can say that it's no problem, and in no way it's gonna be damaging to the system, because the system is immutable, right? So so you can introduce like all those bad ideas. It's completely impervious to it, right? No, like you cannot introduce bad stuff in it because you cannot introduce stuff in it.
Okay.
Whereas on eCash and Lotus and Bitcoin Cash, we have to be much more vigilant and actually understand the system deeply for any change, right? Because you're like, okay, even if it's like one like OP reverse bytes, some simple thing that just reverses a bunch of bytes or something, you have to be like, okay, does this fit into the system? Does this make sense? Or changing the signature algorithm or something like that.
Yeah,
you have to be very...
are we breaking one of the meta rules, even in like some very indirect, convoluted way that is not easy to foresee? You really need to ask yourself a lot of questions.
So for example, one big thing is about scaling, right? So does this change, like many are like, oh no, in this current system, you just do this, and then like it's just a simple change, right? So there's this additional check or whatever. But what could happen is that like, if you want to scale the system, then you have like suddenly all of these interdependencies where it's like, oh, this transaction, and you have to process this before that transaction or something like that, which is, I mean, in my view, this is what happened on Ethereum. They were like, oh, we can just like do away with this and that rule, and we can just introduce these new ones. But what then happened, since they weren't following these meta rules, they were like creating something entirely new. They had like every transaction basically depends on all the previous transactions, right? Whereas on Bitcoin, they sort of like are independent, like more or less. And what that resulted in is that now Ethereum is very, very unscalable, right? Like they have the willingness to okay, let's change the system, right? If we can optimize it, if we can whatever, if we can raise the block size, let's do that. But what they happened due to that, because they didn't follow the original commandments, or so, I don't know, like the original, like they introduced some original sin, so to speak, right? Now they are dealing with the fallout, which is like, okay, all transactions are interdependent, more or less, at least. Like, you know, like if you verify this one, you have to first verify that one. So very, very hard to parallelize. And yeah, and now they have to introduce like a whole complexity. I mean, they have the resources to do that. They have the willingness, they have the smartness to do that. But like it is, if they instead just like didn't have this quote unquote original sin, they could have scaled with much less resources.
Yeah, scaling Ethereum is like an order of magnitude more difficult than scaling Bitcoin because of some early decisions that were made. And those were not decisions about scaling that were made. Those were decisions that were made about smart contracts that end up having an impact on scaling. But at the time, they didn't really think about that.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I mean, this is
and this gets
really
into like
heavy.
the atheism thing. It's like, oh, let's just remove God from the equation, and then people kind of figure it out, right? But then what ends up happening, you have like these drag queen shows and things are like, okay, how exactly did we go from there to there?
This is where you get Dogecoin from.
Well, Dogecoin is still more like Bitcoin, but yeah, I think there could be an argument to be made to
they're the trannies of the monetary system, basically. The blue hair.
Maybe the NFT stuff. The NFT stuff almost literally is that, right? Like I don't want to, you know.
Yeah.
I like, you know, because NFTs are like, okay, this is like a very degenerate form of money because like it's non-fungible, right?
It's non-fungible, so it's like
you can't use
fungibility is one of the property of good money. You want something that is as fungible as possible to be used as money.
So, and they don't want to be money, but you know, like the same could be said about trannies, right? But whatever.
Yeah, they don't want to be reproductive like they're supposed to be.
They don't want to be, reproductive, because a good religion gives you rules to be very reproductive, right? Because
it can't further itself if there are no humans to further it too. You know what I mean? It's
the thing is, here's the thing though, like the rules that religion gives you are rules that are gonna work for most people most of the time. But they are the fringe, and actually like the fringe are the monsters. Like Jonathan Pajot have a lot of content about that is very, very interesting. You kind of need the fringe, but you don't want to put the fringe in the center, right? Like there are gonna be people that live differently, that don't live by the same rules, and that's okay. Though it's not gonna work for most people. Like for most people, they should probably be following the rules because they're gonna be better off this way. But you also have a problem when you want to impose the rule on everyone, because you get into tyranny, and it's kind of like not in the spirit of the rule, actually.
And we saw that with Alan Turing, right? Like he was this incredible computer scientist and whatnot, but because he was a weirdo who didn't like women, and instead like men, like the government intervened and was like, oh no, like we're doing this to help you, right? Like you put on hormones and whatever. And,
well, the dude is known for what he did in computer science, and obviously like breaking Enigma and all of that. He had breakthrough result in many other fields that is not as well known for. He's like first he was a very, very good marathonian. He almost got to the Olympics. It was very, very close. I think there was like some kind of a tournament, and the 3 best person would be selected for the Olympic, and he ended up being 5th, something like that, right? So it was like very, very close to Olympic level. He had many papers in biologies and stuff like that. One that is very interesting about why you cannot develop life in 2 dimension, which is like a mix of biology and mathematics paper.
So what about Game of Life?
But it's way before Game of Life. Like the dude is absolutely incredible in many ways. But yeah, it was He was put on drugs by the government because he was gay, and after that, he basically like had no
Yeah, he
interesting
committed
outlook.
suicide if just like a year or two afterwards because you just
He
like,
ended up committing suicide, but even before that, he was like, I'm like in brain fog all the time. I cannot operate
why.
with those drugs, and so they destroyed him effectively.
Oh yeah.
And we lost an amazing, like, who would have known where, like, we would probably already be on the moon, talking.
But there are many
for
examples of that.
space.
Like Da Vinci, for instance, was almost sentenced to death because he was gay as well in Florence in the 1500s something.
Oh, I didn't know that about him.
Yeah, so he was gay, and he ended up being like, it was like super illegal in Florence at the time.
Oh yeah, of course, Renaissance.
It was like death penalty, right? So he ended up being caught with some other dude. Like there is a dude that slept with a bunch of other dude, including Da Vinci, right? And this dude got caught, and all the dude he was involved with got caught, as a snowball effect. And but one of them was an important guy that were related to the Medici, and as a result, they kind of like
they can't get them all. Yeah,
they kind of like buried the story, and everybody was released. But it's extremely lucky. Like if one of those dude was not an important guy, they would all have been sentenced to death, and there would not have been any Da Vinci, for instance.
Yeah, wow, I didn't know that. But yeah, I mean, yeah, you don't want to
you need the monster. I mean it in the biblical sense.
You need the fringe for innovation, but you can't have the innovators be,
Yeah, you need to have something around, that's just like trying stuff and you need exceptions, but exceptions are for exceptional people.
Yeah, it's like my father's an attorney. He always says, "Hey, you don't make good law based off the exception. You make good law based off the generality, not the exception. And exceptions nearly always make for bad law. So when you put the trannies in charge of making the law, no kidding, you're going to get really bad laws.
No, yeah, you don't want that in the center, but you don't want to reprint that as well. You want to have a room for that to operate, and that is very important, because if that has no room to operate, you get a bunch of pretty bad side effects. Like the whole
I think we're about to come up on 3 hours here.
Yeah.
So, but this has been an excellent conversation. I want to thank both of you for joining today. And I like that we came out with Bitcoin is monetary Judaism. That was a real breakthrough in my mind today. So again, where can people find you, and where can people get your kinds of cash?
So for me, they can find me as DigitalNix pretty much everywhere, GitHub or Twitter or whatever. It's gonna be me. For the project itself, it's gonna be eCash, so e.cash. Very simple. There's the website, and you can find everything you need from there. And maybe I can hand over to Tobias. Yeah,
so I'm Tobias Ruck, Tobias Rock, as you would say, everywhere basically, except on Reddit. So you can find me on Twitter, twitter.com/Tobias Ruck. You can also support me on Patreon now. So all my Lotus work, it's patreon.com/Tobias Ruck again, all spelled together. And I will airdrop Lotus. So if you want to get some Lotus, supporters will get Lotus in return. If you wanna I thought we would talk a little bit about Stamp and something, but if you want to have a private peer-to-peer encrypted messenger, then it's
I think we'll save that one for next time.
Yeah, it's t.me/stampchat. And the project itself for Lotus, it's givelotus.org. So because that's one of the topics we could have talked about, the onboarding. And Lotus has as its meme the giving. And that's part of our domain. So it's givelotus.org if you want to learn about Lotus. Yep. Yeah, quickly, can I have a final word? Because I think there is something important that we did not touch that I want to absolutely touch. People, if you are liberty-minded, you want to be starting to get into those technology now. And I'm not telling put 100% of your money in it, right? But
get some, learn how to use it, try to use it, because by the time you are cut from your financial resources or from the financial system,
It'll be too late.
It'd be too late to wonder, how does the alternative work, right? So if we take the example of what's happening in Russia right now, for instance, they cut all the stuff. It's not like no Russian can be like, I'm gonna get into Bitcoin to work around this crap, because they have no way to buy it, because they are not connected to the rest of the world through the fiat system, right? So it's too late for them. It doesn't have to be too late for you, but really, like, you need to be
Understand it's
learning
coming.
how to use those stuff right now.
Eventually, you're only going to be allowed to buy the CDBC, and I guarantee they're going to
Yeah.
program that thing to say no buying crypto with it. So that's
Or
going
even
to be
worse,
coming.
like if they find that, oh, you bought like $10 worth of Bitcoin, how about we remove all of your money, right? Like even the stuff you didn't use to pay for Bitcoin. So I think that this is what might be coming. We don't know, but
we
yeah,
could
to
make
end on a
very
high
good
note,
educated
right?
guesses.
Yeah, and
So-
we can do another one, I think, because there's a lot of things.
Definitely.
Like we touched really interesting topics. I did not think we would go this way, but I
Yeah.
really enjoyed that. Thanks for having us, Andrew. And
Of course.
yeah, I think people know where to find us. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. Go ahead.
Thank you,
Ed.
Thank
Andrew.
you. Bye bye.